Hello, this is Mr. Egg here. Welcome to part 4 and the final part of Paul's story. If you haven't seen the first 3 episodes, then take a look at the playlist at the top of the screen. Watch the first 3 episodes and come straight back. Paul was standing in the hotel reception, clutching Rose's phone, looking down and seeing that there was an unread message. He clicked the message and he was surprised to find out that it was in Thai language. It wasn't in English. Paul was only on his second trip to Thailand and he had no idea what the message said. So he gave the phone to the hotel receptionist and she read the message and it said, "Sorry that I missed your birthday, my sister. Happy New Year." The red mark on the back of Rose had nothing to do with this message. Rose had explained to Paul that she'd had an accident on her birthday when she was working in the hotel in Hastings, and that's what the red mark was. Paul felt very bad. He put the phone back in the tin box, took the money to pay for Rose's salon appointment and walked back to the salon, thinking that his fears were unfounded, and he began to feel guilty at thinking that Rose had been doing something bad behind Paul's back. Paul returned to the salon and was a little disappointed because although Rose's hair had finished and it looked amazing, she had yet to have her nails done and her makeup, and Rose informed Paul that it would be about another 2 hours. Paul decided he wasn't going to go anywhere. The salon was air conditioned and they served very good coffee, so he just sat and watched as Rose tended to herself, had her nails and her makeup done. And he started thinking and getting excited about the New Year's Eve party that night that Rose was getting ready for, that they were going to attend together in Siam Square. They returned to the hotel eventually, and back at the hotel, they had something to eat in the cafe, then had a sleep, and when they woke up, Rose popped off into the bathroom to have a shower and to get ready for the evening's entertainment. When she came out of the bathroom, Paul was absolutely stunned. She looked magnificent. Not only was her hair, nails, and makeup absolutely perfect, but she was wearing a black dress that Paul had never seen before and matching high heels, and thought that this dress had been bought specially for this event, New Year's Eve, and it was amazing. Plunging neckline and completely backless. When Rose turned around, he couldn't see the red mark. It had disappeared, and Paul thought to himself, well, maybe she's concealed that with makeup. But anyway, he wasn't thinking about that right now. He'd got his dream girl who was going to marry, and they were going out for the perfect evening on New Year's Eve in Siam Square. First of all, they went to the Hard Rock Cafe in Siam Square, and Paul noted that there seemed to be so many beautiful Thai ladies there, all dressed up, looking amazing, but they didn't seem to have their husbands or boyfriends with them, and he wondered why that was. After a drink there, they took the short walk to Siam Paragon, and Rose wanted to take a taxi because she was in her high heels, but they eventually decided to walk. Well, Paul had booked a table at the Thai Indian fusion restaurant there. It was very, very expensive and high class, and it was more like the swanky restaurant that, if you remember in episode 1, Paul had promised to take Rose to when they parted for the first time, when they'd met at the hotel in Pattaya. They sat down, ordered their food. Paul looked around and he thought, this is the life. 2006, New Year's Eve, I'm with the woman I'm going to marry. And 2007 is going to be really special. As Paul and Rose were looking over at the amazing view of Bangkok from the 5th floor where they were eating, suddenly their tranquility was interrupted. There was a loud public address announcement, and it wasn't in the calm voice that had done the announcements previously. This was a very loud Thai language announcement. All of a sudden, around the whole restaurant, activity erupted. Rose got up, as most of the other tables, the customers had also got up. And she said to Paul, go now. There's a bomb that has gone off near here, and there are other bombs that are going off. We need to get out of here as soon as possible. So, Paul and Rose started to move towards the exits. There was running and screaming going on all around them. The waiter who came to see them seemed a lot calmer, and he said to them, there's been a security alert, sir. You need to leave, and could you please settle your bill? So Paul left some cash, which he thought was probably too much for what they'd eaten, and there were crowds running and pushing to get to the escalator so they could get from their 5th floor location down to the ground. And when they got outside, Paul noted how chaotic it was. Unfortunately, the SkyTrain, or the BTS service, the station was closed. They tried to hail a taxi, but all the taxis were already taken. Paul and Rose were supposed to go to the countdown event at Central World and then on to the CM Squared bar in the Novotel Hotel. It was still early on that New Year's Eve evening of 2006, and Paul and Rose decided that the best thing to do was to go to the Novotel, as it would be a safe place to be. When they arrived there, all the hotel staff were eagerly glued to the television. There had been several bombs. In fact, they later found out a pier just in front of the Central World. All in total, 3 people had died and there were 38 people injured. Paul and Rose didn't really feel that they wanted to be out and wanted to go back to their hotel. When they got to the hotel, in the reception area, Rose mentioned that she wanted to phone her parents so that they would know that although there was chaos in Bangkok, that her and Paul were okay and they would still be visiting them the next day. She also wanted to check her emails, and in the days before of smartphones, hotels would have a public computer where people could check emails and other internet business. So Rose signed in to her email account on that shared computer in the hotel reception. As Paul walked round and looked at the screen, he noticed that Rose had over 1,000 emails in her inbox. "Ah, yes," replied Rose, "that's true, but only 2 of them are unread." Unread, thought Paul. Oh no. Earlier that day, he checked Rose's phone. The message that he was suspicious about, that eventually turned out to be from her friend in London. But Paul had read the message, and Rose, when she examined the phone, would realise that somebody had been reading her text messages and been snooping around. Well, this was terrible. There was bombs going off in Paul's mind right now. He had to do something about this, and he had to do it immediately. So as Rose was checking the emails on the computer in the hotel reception, Paul concocted a story that he needed to obtain the telephone number of the car that he had booked to take them to see Rose's parents the next day, and he had to retrieve that from the safe. Obviously, when he got the metal tin from the receptionist, it wasn't the taxi number he was after. He was after Rose's phone, and he quite nervously started to flick through to see if there was any way that he could mark that text message as unread. It was quite an old phone, and Paul wasn't really used to it. He didn't really know the settings, and he tried, but in vain, and there was no way that he could mark it as such. He then tried to get into the settings, and he thought, well, maybe it's in there. All the time, of course, Paul's very tense and nervous. He didn't want Rose to see that he was looking at her phone. As he was doing this, rather than getting into the settings, he accidentally got into the photo gallery. And it was at this point that Paul's night went from bad to worse. As he was flicking through the photographs, the very last photo stunned him. There was Rose, lying on a double bed, seductively, in a modern hotel room. Now, this was before the age of selfies and front-facing cameras, so it had clearly been taken by somebody else. And what's more, she was wearing exactly the same black dress and shoes that she was wearing for tonight's special occasion. At this time, when you took a photograph on a phone, it left a date stamp with the date and the time that the photograph was taken. Paul realised that the time was 2 a.m. on the night of Rose's birthday. Well, this was astonishing. Paul completely froze. There was a shiver that went down him. He panicked. What could he do? He had to do something really quickly. Rose was coming up from the computer screen, so he very quickly deleted the message and decided in his haste not to say anything, not to confront Rose that night about the photograph, because he didn't want Rose to think that he was snooping on her. And in the back of his mind, Paul was thinking that maybe, surely, there was an innocent explanation for this photograph. The next morning, Rose and Paul caught the taxi to take them to see Rose's parents in the province of Korat. When Paul got to the city centre, he was dropped off and he was staying at a hotel. Rose continued to her parents' house, where she would pick up her car and come back to the hotel. And it was the same car that Rose had given Paul a lift in when they went on their first date to that seafood restaurant many months ago in Jomtien. Paul was thinking that maybe he'd made a mistake. He shouldn't have gone to Korat with her. And he was right. He shouldn't have gone. But he wanted to hear Rose's side of the story. Paul was looking and thinking about the best time to confront Rose about the photograph, although he didn't want to mention to Rose that he'd seen the photograph. So he just asked her, "What did you do on your birthday?" And she said that she'd gone to work and she was working very, very hard, injured herself on the door, and then went back to stay in the staff house. But Paul knew that that wasn't correct. He'd seen the photograph. She wasn't in her staff uniform, and also the room where she was photographed in was definitely not the old-fashioned staff house room in the Victorian era hotel where she'd been working. Eventually, Paul and Rose arrived at her parents' house, and he found her mother and father to be absolutely charming. They spoke very good English, and they even mentioned that even the dog in the house liked Paul. The mother said that she couldn't wait for Rose and Paul to be married, and the wedding present would be a plot of land next to her house where Paul could build a house for him and Rose to live in. All this time, Paul had not revealed to Rose that he had checked her phone and found the photograph on there with the date stamp. But that evening, Paul decided that he would tell Rose a little lie. He said to Rose that he had called her that evening at the hotel, and the staff at the hotel had said that she wasn't working that night. Rose was alarmed. He could see it in her eyes. "Were you checking up on me?" she said. "No, I just wanted to wish you a happy birthday." Paul had so many questions to ask Rose, but Rose said no, now's not the time, and she returned in her car to her mother's house. Maybe, thought Paul later, this was to give her time to think of an excuse. Next day, back at the hotel, Rose finally confessed to Paul. "But Paul, it was your fault. It's all your fault. You shouldn't have left me alone." "Why?" said Paul. "It was your idea for me not to cancel the flight. I asked you specifically, and you said, don't cancel the flight. Go to Thailand on your own." "Yes," said Rose, "but you only asked me once. If you'd have asked me twice, I'd have told you the truth, that I wanted to be with you together in Bangkok. So, Paul, it is your fault." Rose explained that no, she wasn't working that night in a hotel. The staff at the hotel had wanted to throw a party for her. After all, it was her birthday. She'd got dressed up in her black dress, and she'd had a little bit too much to drink. She'd been drinking wine, and someone had offered to take care of her. "Someone?" said Paul. "Someone? Who?" Rose told Paul that it was the pianist in the piano bar. It was devastating for Paul. For the first time, he got angry. "Why? Why did you do it, Rose?" Because he was young, fresh, strong, and Italian. Paul started to think, is this some guy or is it a bottle of wine? It's at this point that Paul's head is racing. What about that red mark on your back? He asked Rose. Rose said that he used to clip his fingernails when he played the piano, but he never clipped his thumbnails, and he must have made that mark on her back, and she didn't even know about it. Paul thought that it was probably him that had sent her the Thai Italian dictionary, you know, the one that she won in the Secret Santa. He then began to think maybe everybody in the hotel knows about this situation, and the only person that didn't was Paul. Rose told Paul that she'd had a word with her family, and she told them that she had to return immediately to England to work. It was handy for her because the ticket that Paul had bought her meant that she could change the dates with no financial penalty. At this point, Paul's head is upside down. He returns to Bangkok, and Rose on the phone tells Paul that this situation was just a one-off. She begged for forgiveness. Paul asked Rose to leave her job. After all, Paul couldn't really face seeing all the hotel staff again, especially the Italian pianist. Paul, after his whole holiday had finished, returned back to Tunbridge Wells. He was expecting Rose to be there in his house. As he turned the key in the door and opened it, he got what wasn't a real surprise, but a huge disappointment. Rose and her possessions were all gone. In fact, the only thing that was there that showed that there was a Thai person living there was the bottle of fish sauce that Rose had absent-mindedly left behind in the cupboard. Paul looked around and he saw Rose's keys that she'd left by the Thai orchid that they bought together in happier times at Battersea Park. Underneath there was a note, and Paul opened the note, and on it there were only 3 words: "We belong together." I'd like to thank Paul for sharing the story with us and for taking the time to write it for me, and also for being great at letting people into his life. Thank you, Paul. There are lots of questions that I want to ask Paul, so maybe in the future there'll be an opportunity for me to sit down with him and ask those. I do remember, actually, after we'd decided to do this, I had to go to the hospital, and Paul had got a car, so I asked him if he'd give me a lift, and he says, yeah, and he was kind of, well, I'm going to be a bit busy. And I says, Paul, there'll probably be some nice nurses there. You never know, mate. You could get some normal rules girls. Paul turned round to me and he said, Phil, this is Pattaya. There are no rules. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. If you go to the members area, there's going to be more information on Paul at a later date.